to Pakistan, but right now to Guatemala, where the centrist candidate Álvaro Colom has won the presidential election. This according to official election results released on Monday. In an upset victory, Colom beat the retired General Otto Pérez Molina on Sunday's runoff election. Colom ran on an anti-poverty platform, won close to 53% of the vote. In his victory speech, Colom thanked his supporters.
We won against all odds, against everything, because truth was on our side, because everyone's work and each one of you was efficient, because we didn't cheat or deceive. I said that we would win by between 4 and 7%, and we won by 5.2%.
General Pérez Molina, who led in the polls until last week, ran on an anti-crime platform. The ex-head of Army intelligence, he promised to expand the police force by half and to use the military to fight crime. He commanded troops in one of Guatemala's most violent areas and has been implicated in a number of political crimes. Pérez Molina conceded defeat in a news conference after the results were announced.
We said we would respect the results given by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal and that we would respect the will of the Guatemalans expressed through the ballots, and that's what we are doing. We are present here.
To discuss the significance of the election and the task ahead for President-elect Álvaro Colom, we turn now to Guatemalan-American writer Francisco Goldman. His latest book is The Art of Political Murder: Who Killed the Bishop? It implicates the defeated presidential candidate, General Pérez Molina, in the 1998 murder of the beloved Guatemalan human rights activist Bishop Juan Gerardi. Francisco Goldman joins us again, now from Houston, Texas. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Francisco.
Hi, Amy.
It's good to have you with us. First, your response to the election results.
It's as a lot of my friends emailed me from Guatemala yesterday, Guatemalan democracy was saved. The country was on the verge of people thought that this General Pérez Molina was going to be elected and possibly take them back to some equivalent of the hardline military rule of the 1980s. But the countryside in this vote defeated the city, and this is the first time in Guatemalan history, really, that the indigenous people in the highlands have really voted as a bloc and carried by surprise Colom to victory.
Now, talk about the significance of this. Isn't it the first time that the president did not win the city, but the countryside?
It's definitely the very first time that the Indian population, the Mayan Indian population, and the rural population have really decisively backed one candidate. And everybody, the capital, which, as you know, is more mixed racially and economically and et cetera, is quite separate and existent from its countryside. And in Guatemala City, the media, all the television stations, virtually all the newspapers, which are all owned by pro-business, right-wing type, kinds of people, were heavily backing the general, and let's say not quite allowing news that might harm the general's campaign to get into their media. But
we spoke last week before the election, and you gave quite a frightening profile of the candidate who's been defeated, the General Pérez Molina. Can you briefly summarize who he is again?
General Pérez Molina was during Guatemala's 36-year civil war. It had probably the army, which ruled and dominated throughout that war, gave Guatemala probably the worst human rights record in Latin America and among the worst in the world. 200,000 civilians were killed. A lot of the worst atrocities were committed by Guatemala's intelligence units, especially the G2 and the EMP, the Presidential Military Staff. That's where the death squads came from. That's where the illegal detention centers, the torture centers came from. And General Pérez Molina, a graduate of the School of the Americas and so forth, was a chief of both of those entities. And even in reporting in places like the New York Times, very vicious crimes that he was responsible for have been reported on. But in the 1996 peace accords, the army, as the victor, insisted as a condition for peace, and the acquiescent guerrillas agreed that there should be a blanket amnesty for all human rights crimes, which means that he really couldn't be prosecuted for a lot of those crimes. That was eventually breached when the UN declared crimes against humanity had occurred in Guatemala. There can be no amnesty for crimes against humanity, but impunity still reigns in Guatemala to a great degree, and the courts just haven't been strong enough to carry human rights trials forward. So what really became the issue, though, in the general's campaign were not his wartime crimes, but news beginning to filter out about his peacetime crimes, which included the allegations that are made in a part of my book about his involvement in the murder of Bishop Gerardi, but also corruption charges and involvement in other crimes. These kinds of things began to bubble up on the fringes, but the pro-Perez Molina media in Guatemala kept it out of the mainstream news down there, but it found its way into the population via other routes, let's say.
Once again, talk about the evidence you have for Perez Molina, the general, being implicated in the death of Bishop Juan Gerardi, the man who had just released the Nunca Mas report, the report of hundreds of pages that indicated that it was the Guatemalan military with its paramilitaries who were responsible for the overwhelming number of deaths and disappearances in Guatemala through the 80s.
Well, the evidence that we had, Bishop Gerardi, of course, with that report, presented the boldest challenge to the Army's, piñata of self-forgiveness, as a lot of people refer to as the amnesty, and as the great sort of intelligence guru, General Perez Molina is sort of seen as almost a father figure among the officer class that would be vulnerable because if human rights prosecutions ever came forward. And the evidence we had is eventually, and the book I wrote, of course, chronicles the long legal struggle of these sort of secular young people in the Church Human Rights Office to discover who was responsible for the crime, and to eventually, and it really a story of an extraordinary triumph, how they eventually managed to get 3 military men convicted for the murder, and investigations ordered into higher-ups, which could eventually include Perez Molina. The last government, which was a right-wing government, disbanded the office of the special prosecutor in the Gerardi case to keep that case from going forward. But the key witness in the case told me that Otto Perez Molina had been involved. When I spoke to him when he was in exile in Mexico, I later confirmed that with the head UN investigator, a former Spanish intelligence agent who ran the UN missions investigation in Guatemala, who had his own reasons for believing that, including an account which kind of challenged Perez Molina's alibi that he had been in Washington the week of the crime, so that he couldn't have been responsible. But the UN knew that he had in fact had dinner with the chief of the UN mission 3 days after the murder, and he had warned, he said, don't pay attention to General Perez Molina's alibi that he had a diplomatic passport that says that he's in Washington. He's an intelligence chief. He uses multiple passports. And then after I brought this out in my book, Guatemalan newspaper reporters and the one honest, feisty newspaper in Guatemala, El Periódico, they took it further and discovered that, yes, indeed, he had 7 passports registered under his name, just as that Spaniard had predicted. And also, this reporter discovered that that witness had told the UN investigator about Perez Molina's involvement in the murder 2 days after it occurred during their first interrogation.
Will there be trials of any of those, perhaps even Perez Molina, involved in not only the death, the murder of Bishop Gerardi, but so many others? 200,000 people died during that time.
Colom has said in his declarations that really the most important issue to him is ending impunity in Guatemala and strengthening the judicial system. When I spoke to him on the phone a few months ago, he told me that if he became president, he was going to reopen the office of the special prosecutor in the Harari case. So I really expect him to do that. And it's really important to mention that